Live from London, this is BBC News. Welcome to viewers on PBS in America. Turkey's President Erdogan wins another term in office. The opposition calls it the most unfair election in years. Military officials in Ukraine say they've destroyed more than 60 drones and missiles that were heading to Kyiv. And Imran Khan tells the BBC he wants to meet with Pakistan's military as the crackdown on his supporters continues.
The entire party is virtually being put into jail. All the senior leadership. It doesn't happen in a democracy. This doesn't happen when there's rule of law.
Hello, I'm Mark Lobel. Turkey's long-time president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has secured another 5 years in power after winning the runoff ballot in the country's presidential election. There were joyous scenes on the streets of Istanbul as Mr. Erdogan celebrated with his supporters after winning around 52% of the vote. The 69-year-old will now serve another 5 years in office, potentially stretching his time in power to a quarter century. Addressing a jubilant crowd, President Erdogan promised to build a strong economy and called for unity. Meanwhile, his opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, said it was the most unfair election in years and that he felt saddened by the troubles awaiting Turkey. Aruna Iyengar reports.
Ecstatic Erdogan supporters outside the presidential palace in Ankara last night. Earlier in the day, the president had sung to the crowd and recited a poem. This Erdogan supporter says, "Bye-bye, Mr. Kemal. Thank God Islam has won."
We are very happy, full of joy. I can't even contain myself. I thank God.
Big celebrations, but they don't show that this was the biggest challenge to Mr. Erdogan's authority in years. He became Prime Minister in 2003, later becoming President. To build up that position, he has stifled all opposition. His non-religious rival, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, says the election was unfair. Mr. Erdogan had one big advantage, almost total control of the media. Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu's CHP party had campaigned against crackdowns on dissent and for a return to an independent justice system and parliamentary democracy. A sombre mood here as the results came out.
I am really sad. I think the country is heading towards a darkness. I think it is not looking good for the future of our children and grandchildren.
He left the CHP headquarters in tears. World leaders have been congratulating Mr. Erdogan. He enjoys a big role internationally, a friend to countries in the East, while being a member of NATO. He's also put himself forward as a mediator in the Russia-Ukraine war. But it's back home where divisions may be hard to heal. Inflation is high and rebuilding cities after the earthquakes in February are a massive challenge. Mr. Erdogan promised in his victory speech to return Syrian refugees back to their homeland. Anti-immigrant feeling in Turkey has been growing. October will see the centenary of the Turkish Republic. Mr. Erdogan says he's confident about the future. Others are less convinced. Aruna Iyengar, BBC News.
More now from our reporter Selaam, who's in the newsroom. Selaam, this was a serious challenge to Mr. Erdogan's authority. So how did he pull it off?
It is very interesting how he pulled it off despite a very serious cost of living crisis and economic crisis. And despite what has happened back in February, the devastating earthquakes that killed over 50,000 people. Everyone, opinion polls were suggesting that it would be very difficult for Mr. Erdogan to extend his rule to a third decade given the circumstances. However, he managed to pull it off again. He once again showed that he is this invincible figure in Turkish politics. How did that happen? Apparently, more than half of the people, the voters in Turkey, decided that even though they're going through difficulties, Mr. Erdogan is the man to steer them out of these difficulties because he is the strong figure. They have the trust in him. That is what he said in his victory speech. Trust and stability are very important in politics, he said. And that's apparently how the supporters, the majority of the voters in Turkey, saw it as such. However, having said that, we have to bear in mind that Mr. Erdogan has been controlling, especially the Turkish mainstream media, more than 90% of the Turkish mainstream media, and the opposition argues that the elections were unfair, the race was not played on a leveled field.
Yeah, the opposition not happy, but foreign leaders are now piling in with congratulations, aren't they? From everyone from Vladimir Putin to Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yes, Putin, Zelensky, Biden, Macron, the European Union leaders, everyone has been congratulating President Erdogan. How President Erdogan proceeds in his third decade will be very important. In his victory speech, there were expectations that he would be this conciliatory figure now that the race is over. Initially, he started his speech in such a tone, saying, I will be the president of the whole nation. The race is over. Bygones are bygones. But then he started blaming the opposition of colliding with terrorists. Again, he brought up doctored montage mix videos that he used in the campaign. The opposition accuses him of using these and slandering the opposition candidate. And then he talked about the jailed Kurdish leader, Selaam Demirtas, for instance, and he said he would never be able to be free under his rule. So there was this feeling that this wasn't a very conciliatory speech. This wasn't actually even a victory speech in that sense, but a rally speech, because in 10 months there will be local elections held in Turkey, and Mr. Erdogan, although having secured the presidency, is not entirely happy with how he did and how his party ranked, because they have lost 7% of the votes compared to the previous elections. And Erdogan, being this very ambitious politician, wants to do better in the local elections and get the big cities, Istanbul, Ankara, back. And yesterday, there were the first signs of his campaign. And 52% to 48%, half of the nation is jubilant that their leader is again ruling the country. Half of the nation is very cross with the outcome. It is still and will remain to be a very polarized country. OK,
Selaam, thanks very much for that. Well, you mentioned Istanbul. Let's go live there now and speak to our correspondent, Anna Foster. Anna, I just wanted to start by gauging the mood with you where you are. It must be quite different from back in February when that earthquake took place and you were, of course, there very close to the epicenter. What is the mood like now, months later?
Yeah, I mean, the mood couldn't be more different. You saw in that report a few minutes ago the real ecstatic response of President Erdogan's supporters on the streets here in Istanbul last night. They started to head to the AK party headquarters really as soon as the ballot boxes started to be counted. There were car horns blaring, there were fireworks and flares, there were families, there was chanting and cheering. But you're right to say that one of the big background issues in this election has been those earthquakes back in February. More than 50,000 people died. Thousands and thousands of buildings were either destroyed or left too badly damaged to move back into again. I was there for the first round of voting 2 weeks ago. They had to do special temporary polling stations in temporary buildings. And many, many people had to go back to that area because if they hadn't registered in the area that they live in now, they had to go all the way back to the south of this country in order to cast their votes in the presidential election. Now, interestingly, it doesn't seem to have damaged President Erdogan's vote share in those parts of the country. But there was a lot of criticism of his government at the time because an earthquake was a not unexpected thing to happen here in Turkey. It sits on two fault lines, one very close to here in Istanbul, one in the south. The country had been preparing for years and many people felt that the response was not what it should have been given that level of investment and preparation. But when it came down to it, the Turkish people have chosen President Erdogan. They believe that he is the man to lead them forward. He's launched some ambitious building projects in the south. He said that he will solve those problems, and clearly a majority, 52% of Turkish voters believe him.
I was going to ask you, Anna, how Mr. Erdogan will now go forward and heal those divisions that we heard about from Selaam in the country, because it's not just the economics, is it? It's things like immigration, where the opposition party were really quite strong on that and getting people out of the country.
They were strong in the last 2 weeks because the reason we went to a runoff is that neither of the main candidates managed to achieve more than 50% first time out. And the third place candidate, Selaam, he only had 5% of the votes, but he was an ultra-nationalist. So both sides were fighting for that very ultra-nationalist 5%. And that was why you saw Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's tone and focus really change in these last 2 weeks. And you're right, immigration, particularly the issue of Syrian refugees, became a huge topic here in the country. If you were a Syrian refugee living here, one of the 3 million or more who do, these have been a very difficult 2 weeks because, of course, you knew that both sides wanted you to leave, wanted you to go back to a country that internationally is still not considered safe. So it will be interesting to see how those divisions are healed with the Turkish parts of society as well, with the refugees. President Erdogan made that speech saying that he would bring people together, but I think there's still a long way to go.
And if I'm not mistaken, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was promising to open up the presidential palace for people to go and have a look around. That's not going to be the case, is it? I mean, symbolically, it's more that people have opted for an autocrat rather than a potential democrat.
Yes, that presidential palace, and in fact the location where you saw President Erdogan make that big speech last night. Yes, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has said that he would take that 1,000-room palace, he would open it up to the public. It was all about the democracy that he was going to bring back to Turkey, the freedom of speech. But in the end, there were two quite distinct choices for voters here. There was the strongman, President Erdogan, who has really set himself up as a defender of Turkey, not just domestically, but globally as well. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was offering a more softly spoken, a quieter, more democratic presidency. But when it came down to it, the choice that people here made was the choice of strength, was the choice of an experienced leader. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu hasn't yet won an election. That has been a criticism that's been levelled at him by his supporters. Really, even this morning, people say that there were more charismatic characters in the opposition. Selaam was telling you there about the fact that Istanbul and Ankara both have CHP opposition mayors, and they are now in the sights of President Erdogan. Some people think that if one of those individuals had been the opposition candidate, the result today might have been very different.
Interesting, Anna. Thank you very much, as always, for your analysis there live from Istanbul.